Alright, in this video we're going to go over some Python variable types and how to convert back and forth between some of these types of variables, and we'll see some of the interesting and useful applications of that. So a few of the variable types that we should have seen so far, obviously the integer variable, that's just going to be any number that doesn't have a decimal point. Obviously, if you take any mathematics class, it's just the same as it would be an integer in Python is the same as an integer in math. Floating point variable, that's the Python name for a decimal point number. So 10 would be an integer variable, whereas 10.0 would be a floating point variable. String variable, that's just going to be a string of text. I mean, it could be numbers, but again, we're just treating those as characters enclosed in either single brackets or single quotes or double quotes. List variables, we've seen those where you use the square brackets to include basically any of the integer, floating point, string types. Any of those things could be included in your list. For example, here we have one of each kind, right? So they're separated by commas in the list to denote which items are separate from each other. So obviously 1 is a separate item in the list from 2.0, which is a separate item in the list from text. Dictionaries as well, this is where we have those key value pairs. So we have curly brackets here that indicate that it's a dictionary as opposed to with a list. It's square brackets. And we have the key value pairs that are each separated by a comma, and the keys and values are separated by a colon here. So name would be the key, and then colon, the value for the name would be John in this case. Age would be the next key because we separated here by the comma, and then 50 would be the value for the age key in this dictionary. And the other thing we can do here is use the type function in Python to determine what kind of variable a given object or item is. Right, so if we use type on, let's say, this text here, word, it would return that the type is a string variable because that's the type of variable that would be. All right, so we can test some of these things out. If we want to practice with the type function, we could say print type, and we can maybe just choose a random string here, text, and we could save and run that. And so we get as output down here, the type that it returns is string. And we could replace the text with, let's say, a number, let's say 45.2, and we could run the same program, and now it returns that the type is a floating point variable. And again, if we try this with an integer instead of a floating point, it gives us the type is integer. All right, so the type function can be useful if you're not sure maybe what type of variable something is for some reason. You can easily identify that using the type variable, or sorry, the type function. All right, so we could also use the type function on a given variable, and that's where it might be more useful. So if we say number equals 5, and then we say print type of the number variable, and then we could execute this, and it'll give us that the type is an integer. So notice here, we put the number variable in here. We did not put the actual integer itself. And if we do type of that variable name, then it gives us what type of information is stored in that variable. So in this case, it was an integer number that was stored in the number variable. So we could change this just to test out here, right? If we have 5.1, now this should return a floating point variable because we're still looking at the type of information stored in the number variable here. All right, so if we go ahead and run this, now we have type floating point, right? So the type function can be somewhat useful. But one of the most important things we're going to do here is convert between different variable types. So there's an abbreviation in Python for each of these types of variables. So for integer, the abbreviation is int. For floating point, it is float. For string, it's the letters str next to each other. For list, it's the same word, list. And this is why if you're ever making a list and you want to store it in a variable, you cannot name that variable list because list is a reserved word in Python. So and we'll see what that does in a second. And for dictionary, the shortened abbreviated version is dict with a T. So if we wanted to try something out here, we could say number equals 5.1, and then we could convert this number variable into a different type. So if we wanted to make this 5.1 into a floating point variable, we could, into an integer variable, we could using this int abbreviated keyword here. right? So we could say number and reset its value to int of itself. So now if we save and run this, we should have had number being a floating point here, right? Now we're converting number into an integer, right? So we could then print out the new value of number. If we run this, now number has been truncated to 5 because it was 5.1. We've now converted it to an integer variable. So what we're going to do there is just what the Python shell is going to do is just round this off. So we had 5.1, it's going to round it down to 5. All right, so that's one way that we can use these conversions here. We could also, let's say we have a different variable here called text, and we made the string word. We could do the same thing here. Actually, let's try a different example. Let's say we made this text 55, and then we took this text and we wanted to convert this 55, which is a number, but it's really only a string variable. So this is a number only in name, because if we tried to do math on this 55 number, we wouldn't be able to do it because it's a string function or a string variable right now. So what we could do is take this 55 and convert it to a numerical variable, either an integer or a floating point. So if we take text now and convert it to an int variable, so we're going to set the original variable text, which was a string, and we're going to convert that text variable into an integer, and then we could print text. And we can see here we get 55, but at this point we can't tell whether that 55 is a string or whether it's an integer or a floating point. Technically you can, because there's no quotes surrounding it there, but if we wanted to verify this, we could say print type of the text variable that we set up there, and now we have type is integer for this text. So if you notice, we started here with a string variable because we put it in these single quotes, and then we convert it to an integer, we print it, and then we printed the type, which again, because we converted it to an integer, the type is now integer. So if we wanted to go ahead and do some mathematical operations, we could say print text times 2, and now we can actually do a mathematical operation here. Whereas if we tried to do a mathematical operation up here and say print text times 2, now we're getting a totally different thing. Because we had a string variable, it basically takes the string and multiplies it by 2. So we have 55 and another 55. So it's not actually doing math on the number, it's doing a multiplication of the string. So that's where the difference comes in. If you want to do math on numerical variables, they have to be actual numerical variables, either integers or floating points. You cannot do math on string variables. All right, so I'm hoping that maybe we've seen so far what the most useful thing is going to be for this, and that's using the raw input function, because whenever we use the raw input function, we get a string variable or string input as our information from the function. All right, so what we can do here is let's set up a random raw input query. Let's say age equals raw input of the prompt, how old are you? And then what we can do is, let's say print age, and then let's say print age times 3, and then we could say, now we could, I'm hoping that you have an idea right now of what would happen if we tried to do this based on what type of variable we would be getting from the raw input function. But what we could do now is, let's say we tried to convert this variable age to be a new type. So we can now say age equals int age, and now we would have the age variable, which was going to be some string input, and now we've converted it to an integer. And now we could do some math on this variable. So we could say print age times 3 again, just as an example. And then if we try and run this, so how old are you? We could say 10. So looking at kind of the way we structured this, we said print age. So we printed the variable 10, which again is just a string variable at this point because it came from the raw input function. So when we do age times 3, what we get is 10, 10, 10, because it just repeated that string 3 times. And then if we convert this now to an integer variable and then print age times 3, now we get the number actually being used as a number in the function, or from the print function. So this is going to be the most useful way of converting variables, at least for the basic things that we're going to do. Anytime you use the raw input function, you're only going to get string as your input, but we can easily convert that string input to different types, especially if you're specifically asking the user for a number. You know you're going to get that number, but it's only going to be a string, but then you can convert it using either the int or float conversion functions to make it a much more useful data point, because obviously if you're getting a number, you're going to want to use it as a number, most likely. All right, thanks for watching this video on converting between Python variable types, and I'll see you in the next one.